On November 4th, 1979, it would all seem trivial. A few days earlier, 3,500 Iranian students had marched toward the American embassy in Tehran, threatening to overtake it. The anti-Shah movement, which had begun in early 1978, had grown into a full-fledged Islamic revolution. The Shah was driven into exile, and the Ayatollah Khomeini became the leader of a new and mysterious Islamic republic.
I never had any illusions about Khomeini. I didn't have much familiarity with fundamentalist Islam, but I knew he would be a menace.
If Carter had been more critical of the Shah, conceivably, it would have been a little more difficult for the Ayatollah Khomeini to identify the United States as the great Satan and to say everything that is wrong in Iran is basically the fault of the United States. Maybe the fact that the United States had been a significant player in Iran since 1945 was such that it was too late for Carter or anybody to change the deeply hostile nature of the Iranian Revolution. But it might have made a difference.
In the first few months of the revolution, Carter had worked to build a relationship with the Khomeini regime. But the history of U.S.-Iranian relations would soon catch up with him. For months, the deposed Shah of Iran had wandered the Middle East, then Latin America. Ill with cancer, he asked permission to come to the United States for medical treatment.
There were several of us sitting around the table talking about whether the president should permit the re-entry of the Shah. We had people tell us that if we let the Shah in, there could be a real negative repercussion in Iran. But the Shah was sort of pathetically flying around the world. And here's this great country saying, well, we won't even let you come to one of our hospitals. He went around the room, and a lot of the people said, let him in.
I argued that he should be allowed in because we treated him as an ally in good times, and I felt it was our responsibility to treat him as a former ally, but a friend in bad times. I thought American credibility was at stake.
And he said, and if then this revolution moves in a way to take our employees in our embassy hostage, then what will be your advice? And the room just fell dead.
The Shah arrived in the United States on October 22nd. 2 weeks later, Iranian students seized the American embassy. 53 Americans were to be held hostage until the United States returned the Shah to Iran. Everyone awaited word from Khomeini. Seeing an opportunity to consolidate his revolution, the Ayatollah gave his blessing, calling the U.S. Embassy a den of spies.
The United States of America will not yield to international terrorism or to blackmail.
It was a defining event. This is the entire United States government captured and held illegally under international law and being taunted every day.
The whole world saw these images of these people burning American flags, stomping on images of Carter, and the most rancid sort of disrespect and hatred of the United States on television, around the world, all the time.
I would lie awake at night, trying to think of steps I could take to gain the hostages' freedom without sacrificing the honor and security of our nation, the president wrote. Carter rejected all military options as too risky. The problem, he said, is that we could feel good for a few hours until we found that they had killed our people.
He was determined to bring every one of those men back alive. You see the moralism of Carter, the Christianity affecting his foreign policy making, his belief in each human life having a great sanctity to it, his not wanting to have blood on his hands.
Successful statesmen have to balance risks, and sometimes a risk to a relatively limited number of lives down the road saves many, many more lives.
To react in a way that was strong and powerful would have set us off down a road that no man could say where it might lead. People have a hard time remembering that this was before the Cold War was over. And the possibility of a superpower confrontation in and about Iran had always been there. And now, under these circumstances, it was much higher.
The dangers of the Cold War were driven home when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Christmas Day, 1979. 3 years earlier at Notre Dame, Carter had declared the United States free of that inordinate fear of communism. But Soviet-American relations had soured. Afghanistan was the final blow.
Have you changed your perception of the Russians in the time that you've been here? You started out, it seemed to a great many people, believing that if you expressed your goodwill and demonstrated it, that they would reciprocate.
My opinion of the Russians has changed most drastically the last week than even the previous 2.5 years before that. It's only now dawning upon the world the magnitude of the action that the Soviets undertook in invading Afghanistan.
I think he'd learned that moral affirmation by itself didn't necessarily get very far. I think he felt that events had built up and conspired against him, as they had, and that the Soviet Union was indeed a real threat.
I've cut Soviet access to high technology equipment and to agricultural products.
Carter leveled sanctions against the Soviets, boycotted the Summer Olympics in Moscow, and withdrew his sought-to treaty from the Senate floor.
The Iran crisis, America held hostage.
Good evening, the 100th day of captivity for 50 Americans in Tehran.
The 100th flag for 100 days of captivity.
In both Iran and
As spring 1980 approached, the hostages had grown into a national obsession. Their memory kept alive by millions of yellow ribbons.
And the nation shares their ordeal.
No stone was left unturned trying to bring them home. While Secretary of State Cyrus Vance dealt with Iranian government officials, Hamilton Jordan met secretly with anyone who held out hope.
I think I have an infection in this eye.
Our lives became a seesaw of emotions as scheme after scheme fell apart, Rosalind later recalled. Every time we saw the hostages on television, I counted them.
Excuse me, what's this book about?
No one can know how much pressure there was on Jimmy to do something about that. And I would go, why don't you do something? And he said, what would you want me to do? I said, mind the harbors. He said, okay, suppose I mind the harbors. And they decide to take one hostage out every day and kill him. What am I going to do then?
Fairly or not, it came to symbolize the question of whether Carter was a leader, whether he was competent, whether he was strong.
By April, pressure was growing intense and the situation increasingly hopeless. We could no longer afford to depend on diplomacy, Carter was forced to conclude. I knew from an intelligence report that there was little prospect of the hostages' release for the next 5 or 6 months. I decided to act. It was called Desert One. It required 6 C-130 transport planes, a 90-man rescue team, 2 C-141 Starlifters, 8 helicopters, and nearly impossible logistics.
It was a highly risky operation. The CIA even talked about the number of people, including the hostages, who might be killed. But it was doing something.
South of Tehran, in the Iranian desert, the rescue mission turned into a disaster. 2 helicopters failed. Another crashed into a C-130 in a sandstorm. 8 men died in Desert One. 3 more were severely burned.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it. When problems developed, the responsibility is fully my own.
I sort of thought at the time, well, people will give the president credit for trying. But I also realized that now the chances of being able to get those people out anytime in the near future was very, very slim. And that, from a political standpoint, that was going to be a heavy burden to bear.
In August 1980, President Carter survived the challenge from Senator Edward Kennedy for the Democratic nomination. The campaign had been bitter and divisive, but in the end, Kennedy had seemed too liberal and too tainted by scandal.
The attack from the left was extremely debilitating. And the fact that we had a divided party going into the general election in 1980 against Ronald Reagan was an additional albatross beyond the hostage crisis and beyond inflation.
Jimmy Carter's administration tells us that the descendants of those who sacrificed to start again in this land of freedom may have to abandon the dream that drew their ancestors to a new life in a new land.
Republican candidate Ronald Reagan launched his campaign on Labor Day with a broadside attack delivered before an audience of working-class Americans.
It is a litany of despair, of broken promises, of sacred trusts abandoned and forgotten.
Today, the vigil of the hostages lengthens to 1 whole year.
The Monday before Election Day played like a nightmare for Jimmy Carter.
Today, the module spelled out conditions for release of the American hostages now ending their first year in captivity. And the 4 conditions are the same as those set down in September.
A good portion of that weekend leading up to it, and all day Monday, Americans were literally having their nose rubbed in this embarrassing, irritating, humiliating situation.
Carter campaigned all day and into the night in Mississippi, Oregon, Washington.
The people must decide this election. For your sake and for the sake of your children, vote. Vote for yourselves. Tomorrow, vote for yourselves. Vote Democratic. Help us. God be with you.
Went in to hear his speech thinking that I was the only person there who knew that basically the election was over and that we had lost.
It was a landslide. Carter won only 6 states. For the first time in 28 years, the Democratic Party lost control of the Senate. On the last day of his presidency, Jimmy Carter stayed up through the night. A deal with Iran had been reached. The release of the hostages was imminent. A crew from ABC News stood by to record the historic moment.
You're not sending that film. He wanted to get these hostages home on his watch. And this was not about getting reelected anymore. This was about getting this done because he felt so deeply about it. We were in the Oval Office around maybe 2 in the morning and nothing happening. Dead silence. But we got to the time where it was 9 in the morning. We had to be at the inaugural. The new president was coming in at 11. And finally, we all started running off. And we still had one officer back there with a phone, the hotline, in case there was any news.
Here they are now.
Is there any word about the hostages? Have they taken off?
Susan?
And he was in contact with Carter all the way up the inaugural route and on the platform. So if there were anything that was positive or negative, he'd hear about it.
And the home of the...
And of course, the story was that Khomeini released them the minute after Reagan was president.